You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Craig Shirley. He's a terrific author. I have several of his books. He's a longtime public relations professional, a winning Republican strategist. And that's no doubt. He's got the best stories. His books are terrific. Titles include Reagan's Revolution, the untold story of the campaign that started it all. My favorite, Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan and the campaign that changed America. December 1941, 31 Days that changed America and saved the world. And his newest book, which came in February of 2022, April 1945, The Hinge of History. Mr. Shirley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's an honor.
Thank you, Robert. It's an honor for me, too. Thank you very much.
Let's get started with some...
Chris.
Chris Spangle, yes. We have a hard time starting these history podcasts because Mr. Spangle has lots of questions before we get to the actual questions.
more power to him. You know, if you have intellectual curiosity, that's good.
Let's talk about something you wrote just a week ago. Before we talk about your books and your career, I'm fascinated by both. You wrote a terrific article for Fox News about the relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and President Ronald Reagan. Obviously, the Queen's passing is the catalyst for writing it, but how close was their friendship and how much did they influence each other?
Robert, they were close from the first time they met, and they exchanged correspondence many, many times. They met together in London, in Washington, and at the Reagan Ranch out in California. They also met on the Queen's yacht, Britannica. So I don't know how many times offhand they met, but it was at least half a dozen times, if not more. And although she never said, she knew 15 presidents, going back to Harry Truman. She wisely never said who her favorite president was. But historians and writers and scribes and observers will tell you that her favorite president was Ronald Reagan. They bonded together in part because, well, first of all, they were both conservative. They were, you know, and behaviorally conservative, not just politically, ideologically, but behaviorally. She was never, imagine this, in 70 years, cameras are on her all the time. She could be caught, dropping her handkerchief in the wrong pew or something like this, but she never, ever, she was never caught off base. She never was caught with another man. She never was caught, drinking too much or did drugs or anything like this. She was always cordial and professional and intelligent and capable and petite and just she was everything good we can hope for in a world subject or individual. And Reagan was the same, although, he had he had one divorce, which he didn't want. She wanted it. She wanted it because she was having an affair with Lou Ayres on her movie she made.
About Jane Wyman. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. What was the name of that movie about the blind girl? I can't remember. But Lou Ayres was in that movie too, and she started having an affair with him.
Helen Keller movie?
No. She won an Academy Award for it. Well, I'll think of it in a second.
Mm-hmm.
She won an Academy Award for it, too. I'm having a senior moment. I beg your pardon. I guess that's because I'm a senior citizen. Anyway, I'm going far afield here, but Reagan was courtly and gentlemanly and funny and kind and honorable and all those things that she expected in men. And so they were of like mind. So they quite naturally bonded together. Especially they loved morning horseback riding, and they both loved the outdoors. So they rode together in California, they rode together in London, they rode together in Washington. And they got along quite well. Her letters to him, and there were numerous letters. She would sign it. She would open it by saying, "Dear Mr. President," and then close it by saying, "Your friend Elizabeth." Not Queen Elizabeth. Not no honor, no honorific, no title, no royalty, no nothing. Just Elizabeth. I thought that was quite charming, actually, for her to have such confidence to be able to just say just Elizabeth and nothing else.
I loved your story, and I'll put a link to it when we post this podcast. It's a terrific article. But
thank you.
When I was doing some research and trying to get all my notes together and things to do this podcast, and we're talking with author and historian Craig Shirley, it was funny. I almost completely forgot to include the recent passing of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah,
just completely overshadowed. It's hard to fathom unless you were around in the 80s. He was the man of the world, the most famous person, got all the accolades, and he just kind of died like an afterthought and then completely overshadowed by the Queen's pass. Please talk a little bit.
I wrote an op-ed on that too.
Please talk. I haven't seen that one. I'll look it up, but please talk about the relationship between Gorbachev and President Reagan, because you talk about two people who changed the world.
Well, Robert, yeah, that's a great question. What I said in my op-ed is that the accolades and the hosannas and all this for Gorbachev were overstated. Gorbachev didn't end the Cold War. Reagan won the Cold War. A series of events. There was the military coup, and there was Chernobyl, and the Russian infrastructure was crumbling, and the Russian economy was crumbling. And then Reagan was pressuring him heavily from the West with everything from SDI to selling him shoddy oil cleaning machinery to the Radio Free Europe and the bully pulpit, which was quite powerful then. But he used all these things and more and SDI. The Soviets were terrified of SDI, and Reagan knew how to use it. He knew how to hold his cars. He knew how to buff Gorbachev, out of position, and he did so. And I always imagine after Reykjavik, when the negotiations broke down because Reagan wouldn't give up on SDI, and the deal was we'd get rid of all of our MX class, all of our Pershing II, all the Soviet missiles and all the U.S. missiles. We would withdraw from Europe if Reagan would give up SDI, and Reagan said no. And I just imagine Gorbachev going back to his generals in Moscow and they're exclaiming incredulity. No, wait a minute, Mikhail. You wouldn't get rid of the missiles because of a theory?
Well, that's true. Didn't he say to Shevardnadze? I read, and I'm guessing you read it or have talked to him about it personally, but Ken Edelman's book, Reagan at Reykjavik, which is terrific. Yes. It's a great book.
Yes.
I love those insider accounts.
I know Ken well.
Where Gorbachev's like, they can't even they're not have the capacity to make toothpaste. Like, we can't make enough toothpaste for our Russian citizens or Soviet citizens. And we're going to compete with SDI. You really get a sense of how broken down and inefficient that communist system was.
Yes. It had come to the end of its rope. Margaret Thatcher was right. She once said the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. And the Soviet Union had run out of other people's money. And of course, we had propped it up with credit guarantees and grain guarantees and things like that. And all we did was promulgate the failing Soviet system when we should have left well enough alone or put stress on it, as Reagan did, and pushed them over the cliff.
Do you think Reagan was proved correct in his entire
sure.
approach towards the
Absolutely.
Soviet Union, even though obviously towards the end, it changed as opposed to, 81, 82?
Yes, it changed at the end. Obviously, yes, it changed, Robert. It did, and the left wing intelligentsia, gave Gorbachev the Nobel Peace Prize and gave Gorbachev Man of the Year and this and that and the other.
Man of the Decade, Time Magazine.
Decade. Yeah, exactly. But it was Reagan who actually deserved it. It's just because they're left wingers and because they despised Ronald Reagan because he was conservative. People don't realize he did exactly what he said he was going to do. In the 1980 campaign, he denounced SALT. He proposed SALT too, and he proposed, look, we won't get Soviets to the negotiating table until we build up our arms so we can force their hand and get them to real concessions. And so that's what he did. He built up our military, built up the army. He built up our defense forces. He deployed Pershing II missiles and MX missiles in Western Europe. He increased the number of Soviet-launched submarines. The whole goal at the time was a 600-ship navy, which he achieved so that they could patrol both oceans. All these things he did and more to build up America's defenses. And then he got the Soviets waking in their boots to the negotiating table. He did exactly what he said he was going to do.
And you'd have to be a scholar of the period or to be alive. I was born in 1967, so I remember the Reagan years, of course, very, very well. To understand or include in any analysis or evaluation the ridiculously large and just quite frankly ridiculous nuclear power and nuclear weapons protest and nuclear freeze, and President Reagan's going to start a World War III. I mean, there was all this hysteria. I mean, not just by people who were on mushrooms, but by scholars and other people who all thought Reagan was going to destroy the planet.
All being funded by the KGB. All those nuclear freeze movements in the United States and in Western Europe were all being funded by the KGB under the table. The FBI documented it. They also documented that the KGB had paid for the anti-war protests, the anti-Vietnam War protests of the student marchers in the 1960s.
Is it ironic to look back and all the hyperbolization of social media and everything we do now with the 24-hour news service and all the things and there's people who look back with, I miss the Reagan Republican Party, and you want to go, but 40 years ago, you said he was going to destroy the planet.
Yeah, exactly. There's a new movie out. Speaking of that, Robert, there's a new movie out called, Ghostbusters Afterlife. Mm-hmm. And in there, Dan Aykroyd is on a phone, and he says, yeah, you remember the 80s, the Reagan years, good economy.
We'll want to talk a little bit more about President Reagan later on in the Leaders and Legends podcast. But reading through your bio materials, you seem to be like a lot of folks I know, and that is you caught the political bug early. What are some of your first political memories?
How far back you want to go?
Well, I was born in 1967, as I said, and I can remember Nixon winning in 1972, and then, of course, Watergate summer in 1973. So that's as early back as I can go. I know you can beat that.
I was politically active early. My parents were charter members of the New York State Conservative Party. This is 60 years ago, and New York was a far different state then than it is now. Now it's taking central. But then there was a vital and active conservative party that held the balance of power in the state. If you got a conservative party endorsement together with the Republican Party, you could win in many congressional districts in New York. And as a matter of fact, in 1970,
James Buckley
was Jim Buckley. That's right, exactly. Mm-hmm. He wasn't the Republican, he wasn't the Democrat, he was the conservative. So, but anyway, my memory goes back to 1964 when I was. My parents had me distributing presidential material door to door for Barry Goldwater. So, so I did it. I was already activated. Flash forward years later to 1977, I was interning in the United States Senate, and I was in the Russell office building, and I go flying down a flight of stairs one afternoon with a message for my senator over on the Senate floor. And I go past this elderly man who's struggling down the stairs, limping all by himself, who's limping down the stairs and struggling. And I said, as I go flying past him, I said, I know that man. I turned around, it's Barry Goldwater. I said to myself, well, I got to introduce myself. So I go up to him all flustered, and, as you would expect from a 19-year-old. Hello, Senator Goldwater. My name is Craig Shirley. I went door to door for you in 1964 in Syracuse, New York. Blah, 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 blah. Like all this stuff. And he looks at me, gets a twinkle in his eye, and he smiles, and he says, "Bet you got a lot of doors slammed in your face." And he was actually right. I did. So that's 1964 is I think as far back. Although I would tell you, in 1960, I have a vague recollection. I was then 4 years old, so I have a vague recollection. We were sitting at the dining room, dinner table, and my father went around and asked the three of us, three children, who we wanted to be president. And my brother said Nixon, my sister said Nixon, and I said John Kennedy. And he said, why? And I said, well, because I think he's better looking than Richard Nixon. And he laughed. He says, you know what, Craig? A lot of people are going to vote that way tomorrow.
The Goldwater campaign in 64, where he loses handily to Lyndon Johnson, would you consider that the nadir of the modern conservative movement? Or more of a catalyst to the good times that come behind it?
It's a catalyst. It's a catalyst. There was a saying after the 64 campaign, we went around saying, look, 27 million people can't all be wrong. We knew we were right. We knew we had truth on our side. We had logic on our side. We had intelligence on our side. The Great Society, the New Deal was a lie to the American people. That collectivism didn't work anywhere, and it certainly wouldn't work in the United States. And Nixon didn't so much prove that. 16 years later, Reagan proved that his ideas were better than Carter's ideas, and I still believe that today.
Would you consider yourself a Goldwater conservative? And if so, how did you make it through the Nixon years, or was that much difference between them?
No, yes, there was a lot of difference between them. Yes, I consider myself a Goldwater, Reagan, constitutional, libertarian conservative. I believe fervently in the privacy of the individual. More than once in my life, somebody's asked me some question, and I've said to them, that's none of your business. That's none of your business. A guy said to me, we had a dispute about the property taxes on our house. So we went before the tax board, and of course they all gave themselves, 1%, 2%, 3% interest. And they gave me a 45% interest rate over a 3-year period. And the guy smartly says, well, but you do have the nicest house in the county. We live in an old antique house in Essex County. And I told him, I looked at him dead in the eye. I said, that's none of your business. I have a very refined sense of privacy. And I guess that's what motivates me as much as anything. The idea that the government could look into my checking account is so abhorrent to me. It's caused me to think, there are times when I really want to leave this country. I want to sell everything, liquidate everything, get on my sailboat and sail down to Belize.
There were many people who, when Ronald Reagan ran in 80, thought that he was going to do all these terrible things. Did, in a sense, that whether it's tax cuts or supply side economics or the defense buildup, the list goes on and on. I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah, all those terrible things.
Well, it's interesting how people went crazy when he fired the air traffic controllers. But
yeah, sure.
If you were standing up in front of an audience of 1,000 people and you've done a lot of lectures and taught classes, what would be the most convincing case that you could make for the Reagan way of doing things?
They broke the law. They broke the law. It was against the law for them to go out on strike and endanger the nation's travelers.
You're talking about the air traffic controllers.
Yes, the air traffic controllers. They already had a sizable salary increase, and then they wanted something even more egregious. And they said, no, if we don't get it, we're going on strike. And the government said, no, you just got a pay raise. We're in the midst of a recession. You just got a 25% pay raise. So if you go on strike, you will break the law, and you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and you will never be an air traffic controller again. That's what Reagan did. He was protecting the American people.
In more than one book, and you correct me if my memory's faulty, but I've read that President Reagan's termination of the air traffic controllers due to their illegal strike made a significant impression.
That's true.
Upon the Soviets, like, yes. This guy's different.
Yes, George Shultz said that. George Shultz, who was Nixon's second Secretary of State, who was unlike Al Haig. Al Haig, if you remember, had an ego the size of Manhattan, and he tried to pull this on Reagan all the time. Reagan one time wrote in his diaries, the day he fired Al Haig, and Reagan wrote in his diary, said that the only thing we disagreed on was who was president. But George Shultz was a terrific Secretary of State, and George Shultz is the one who said that the air traffic controller strike and Reagan's handling had a big impact on the Soviet Union. Not only for the way he treated labor, of course, the Soviets prided themselves on being a labor state and the workers' paradise and all those other lies, but how he manfully handled it. He didn't negotiate. He didn't cry. He didn't cry into his handkerchief. He didn't sob or fret. He said, "You're fired. Get out." And that scared the hell out of the Soviets.
It's interesting when you mentioned George Shultz. I had lunch. I went to summer school at Georgetown University, and for that Intercollegiate Studies Institute program.
Sure.
Back in summer of '93.
Excellent program.
It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And I have to admit that the highlight is being able to walk up and down the Exorcist stairs every day to get to the Blue Line. Anyway,
I doubt anybody remembers that anymore. Every time I drove past that on Key Bridge, and then on the road that goes up the New Mexico Avenue, goes up to AU, I would point out to friends and say, those stairs, those are the Exorcist stairs. And they would, say be impressed or whatever, but I doubt anybody even knows it anymore.
Is it how much the right, for lack of a better term, and I hate to say hard right because that's usually a progressive or left-wing pejorative, but I remember having lunch one-on-one with a significant conservative leader named Howard Phillips, who I'm sure you know.
Howie.
So this is the summer of '93, and he went on a philippic about, because he was the one who publicly called Reagan a useful idiot for Kremlin propaganda or something like that.
Yeah.
How did Reagan lose those harder, Paul Weyrich and some of the other harder or more conservative people? And in the end, did he have to in order to get what he wanted from the Soviets?
I was there at the press conference when Howard Phillips said that. It was about 1987. I can't think of it now.
Which START treaty or the?
No, it wasn't START. It was anyway. It was the treaty between Reagan and Gorbachev that Reagan ended up signing. INF treaty. Thank you. Yes, right. INF treaty. Howie Phillips was always a pain to Reagan. Reagan said so in his diaries. And Howie was a friend of mine. I disagreed with him on many things. I think it was a dark side to conservatism that he embraced, which was rejected by most logical conservatives. There are 100 different forms of conservatism. There's everything from Descartes, I think, therefore I am, to Kissingerism, which I wouldn't even say is conservatism. But all along the way, Robert, there are many different forms of conservatism. And Howie was part of the darker side. And I'm trying to think, maybe, I wouldn't say John Locke in his later years, when he wrote his anti-religious treatise, was in his early years, he was magnificent. But in his later years, when he was writing anti-Christian treatises, that's when he turned to the dark side and actually, he said something awful about George Washington's death. He said, that it was good that George Washington had died. That's how bad he had turned. And as a matter of fact, was practically evicted from the United States and lived out the rest of his life in England. And, nobody can find his bones. Nobody knows where he's buried. Nobody knows whatever happened to him. So Paine was over there in his later years, along with Howie Phillips and Paul Ryrick and others. They misinterpreted American conservatism as being about control. And true American conservatism is about anti-control. We're actually very uncomfortable with power. We don't like power. We like we like revolution, intellectual revolutions, peaceful revolutions, but we don't embrace the type of conservatism that Paine or Howie Phillips or Richard Viguerie or Paul Wyrick embraced. It also was about simple publicity. I was there at that press conference. David Keene was a Washington troublemaker and access seller, and Richard Viguerie was a direct mail maestro who's a good guy. And I played poker with Richard a million times. Wonderful, wonderful person, but he wanted to keep things churned up because it was good for direct mail fundraising. That was why he did it. So it didn't have any lasting effect, that press conference or what they said about, long about the same time, Nixon and Kissinger in ironies wrote a op-ed denouncing the IMF treaty. Nixon with crocodile tears running down his face after he made all the deals with the Soviets, and then he denounces IMF. And Kissinger, the uber neoconservative, the one who once said is that that we were the Soviets were Sparta and we were
Athens.
Thank you. And his job was to bring us in for a safe second place, bring us in the landing for a safe second place. Of course, he didn't know his history very well because actually Athens defeated Sparta in the 300 Years' War, but he didn't know his history very well. But that tells you his mindset. He was the author of the Warsaw Pact Treaty, which ceded all of the Warsaw Pact nations with the stroke of a pen to the Soviet Union. So anyway, there was a lot of strangeness going on at the time. I witnessed it. I spoke out against it. Reagan was, of course, right about IMF treaty. It was certified. We did have, nuclear missiles withdrawn from the Soviet Union, withdrawn from the West, and it led to a more peaceful world. And what's wrong with that?
Thomas Paine, you were talking about him earlier with Washington, accused Washington of having no principles. Did you abandon your principles, or did you ever have any?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, good. Bravo. Yes, he said that. That's it.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest is author and historian Craig Shirley. He's also a public relations professional and a winning Republican strategist who has written so many incredible books about the Reagan Revolution and that time in history. I want to ask you, please, just a few more questions because I do want to get to your World War II books.
As long as you want to go, Robert, I'm enjoying this so immensely.
That's very kind. We're enjoying it. It's a good conversation.
Yes, it is.
One of
your British bulldog you have, by the way.
I've done some commentary here for local TV. My graduate degree is in medieval history, medieval British history, and so when the Queen died, I've done a few Zoom interviews. So I thought I'd put the bulldog and the red telephone behind me.
Yeah. I see it now. Yeah, I see the red telephone. Sure.
Are there other books and authors on Ronald Reagan or the Reagan presidency that you would recommend?
A Pope and the President by
John Sullivan.
Paul Kingor.
John Sullivan wrote the one about Thatcher.
About Thatcher and Reagan. Yeah, John Thatcher wrote that. Yes. So that's a good book also. And then, of course, Reagan's Life and Letters by Annalise and Marty Anderson. Annalise is still alive, thank God. Marty passed away a couple years ago. And Karen Skinner. They wrote several books about Reagan's writings, and then they wrote Reagan Path to Victory about his radio addresses, which is a must read. It tells you a lot about the 1970s. Lou Cannon's books, of course. Lou Cannon is a good friend of mine, and he's written a number of very, very good. What's interesting, I'll tell you what's interesting, Robert, is that Lou, for the most of his life, was a garden variety left-wing Democrat. And he wrote his books about Reagan. Of course, he'd been covering Reagan for years, going back to when he was governor. And he wrote his books that were pretty harsh, pretty tough on Reagan. And reviewers noted it. And then along about the time Reagan announced the Alzheimer's, but before he passed away, Lou rewrote the books. And they were reissued. And they were much more favorable, kindly, tenderly toward Ronald Reagan.
And I remember one instant.
Lou went from being a harsh anti-Reaganite to being all Reaganite. And as a matter of fact, he was with a panel on the Reagan Library hosted a panel a couple years ago. It was myself and Peggy Noonan and a couple others, Steve Hayward and Lou. And this was after Lou had rewritten his books. And now he was a confirmed Reaganite, whereas just a couple years before he was confirmed anti-Reaganite. So that tells you a lot.
I remember as a 92, in 1992, I think, there was all the discussion about then Governor Bill Clinton being a draft dodger.
Yes.
And a lot of people were defending Clinton by saying that Ronald Reagan was a bigger draft dodger, and Lou Cannon came out of nowhere and just hit those people right between the eyes.
Yes. I remember that. It was well done. It was extremely well done. And just for the people who are watching today or viewing and listening today, is that Reagan tried for active duty 3 times in World War II, and 3 times he was turned away because he had the worst eyesight you can imagine. He had something like 2,700. When he was a small boy, he thought the world was blurry. He really thought the world was blurry until one day in his parents' car, he absentmindedly picked up his mother's glasses and put them on. And they had roughly the same eyesight anyway. And he discovered that trees weren't just a green blob. They actually had leaves. And the grass wasn't just was massive green blob. That they had actual shoots and things. So his eyesight was so bad, Army tested him, of course, and he was rejected 3 times. So that's why he went into the movie production corps, making training films and things like that. His eyesight was so bad, he couldn't make out a tank if it was more than 7 feet from him. If it was 8 feet from him, he couldn't make it out. He couldn't make it out that it was an actual weapon of destruction. That's how bad his eyesight was. He tried to get in, whereas Bill Clinton tried everything to get out.
There was a local Indianapolis or Indiana-based writer, and you've talked to him, actually. I'm going to mention his name here in a second. It's Adam Wren.
Yes.
And I just sat down with him not long ago. We were talking about various things. And I told him you were coming on the podcast, and he sent me this terrific article that he wrote about the 1976 Republican Convention, in which he interviewed most, if not all, of the major players. 1976, Ronald Reagan runs against incumbent President Gerald Ford. It's somewhat, Ford kind of has it at the beginning, and then Reagan comes on strong. Please correct me if that's incorrect.
No,
but
you're right.
Then it gets really rocking and rolling at the convention, which I think was in Kansas City in 76.
Kansas City in 1976.
And Reagan comes a hell of a lot closer
to Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City, Missouri comes a hell of a lot more close to snatching the nomination than you could have predicted a year before.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that convention and why that convention is such a watershed in American political history, because we've never had a convention like it since.
No, never. It is the first time Teddy Roosevelt challenged William Howard Taft for the nomination in 1916 and came astonishingly close. Taft only won in the end because he controlled the levers of power at the convention. And of course, then, as we all know, Teddy Roosevelt went on to create the Bull Moose Party, which actually performed better than Taft did in the fall election, but cost the Republicans the presidency, and Wilson was elected. So it's the closest contest we've had since 1916. It came down to, depending on how you counted, it came down to about 80 delegate votes. 80 delegate votes, actually 40, because if you flip 40, then one side goes down by 40, the other side goes up by 40, and Reagan might have well been the nominee in 1976, had it not been for Mississippi flipping oddly 30 delegates right there. And
duplicitously.
What's that?
Duplicitously.
Yes, exactly. The chairman of the committee, whose name escapes me. I'm having a lot of senior moments today. I beg your pardon. I'll think of it in a second because I write about him extensively. He betrayed Reagan. He said Reagan was going to support him, and then in the end, he supported Gerald Ford. And shenanigans in about 5 delegations, including New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, where several, probably 20, 30, 40 delegates were delivered to Ford, which should have gone to Ronald Reagan. It's not like delegate counting today. There wasn't the meticulous counting then that there is now. So Reagan, he left the convention convinced that the nomination was stolen from him, and who's to say that he wasn't correct? But it was interesting. My wife was actually there. She was there as a young. My wife was as a young. They called presidentials. They were young Ford supporters. Whenever Ford would show up at a public location, they'd cheer him on. So my wife was a Ford supporter in 1976. I later educated her very, very quickly, and she loves Ronald Reagan now. She loves Ronald Reagan.
Let's talk
but
about.
I'll tell you, it's interesting. We went to Ford's funeral, and we saw Susan Ford there. Mm-hmm. And I turned to Susan. I said, my wife Serene here was a presidential in 1976, and Susan got so emotional about that. It was brought back such a happy memory for her of these kids all rooting for her father. I think she was really touched.
I believe it. I believe it.
Yeah.
If I had told Craig Shirley on August 10th, 1974, that 6 years and change and a few months later, that Ronald Reagan, a Republican, would be elected president with 489 electoral votes 6 years after Richard Nixon, a Republican, resigned the presidency due to Watergate, you would have said?
I would have said, ridiculous. The Republican Party is on its deathbed. After Watergate cleared out and the Watergate elections cleared out a whole generation of Republicans, and all those Republicans had to resign. Nixon, Spiro Agnew, all sorts of White House aides. The Republican Party was really bereft of operatives like your friend who you just interviewed, and a lot of others coming in 1976. The Reagan campaign was a children's crusade. There were a lot of people there who had never worked in national politics before. They were junior varsity players. They were volunteers. They were in over their heads, but they had no choice. And Reagan does this astonishing thing. He comes within 80 delegate votes, and he gives one of the most significant campaign speeches in American history. He does it. It's extemporaneous speech. You ought to look at it sometime.
And is it a good thing that he lost in 76, in your view, if you look back?
No, I know a lot of people say 76 got him ready for 1980. But I think in 1976, Reagan was in top form. I mean, really in top form as far as being a politician and being a public speaker and all that. And he may well have cut into Jimmy Carter's Cotton South and take, the big Ford lost because he lost Ohio, 4 million votes cast, and he lost by 7,000 votes. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Cleveland, Ohio is the headquarters of the Teamsters, who had endorsed Jimmy Carter that year. So that's right. Yeah, you add 2 and 2 and you figure out what it comes out to, right? He loses Texas narrowly. He loses Mississippi narrowly. He loses Ohio narrowly. And I think Reagan would have taken those votes. And also, Ford, remember, made a hash of the debates. Yeah. And Reagan would not have done that. Reagan would have not performed badly as Ford did in the second presidential debate. Mm-hmm. Just totaling up how Reagan was such a superior campaigner, how these states were stolen from him. The issue cluster in 1976 was all Reagan's. Reagan was an outsider and a populist, and that's what the people wanted in 1976. Reagan would have beaten Carter.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few years, because I've read several books on the 1980 election, yours obviously being one of them. It's terrific. I really enjoyed the Jack Germond, Jules Wickover book on the 1980 election.
Blue Smoke and Mirrors.
Blue Smoke and Mirrors. It's a very good book.
Yes.
So
harsh.
Wait, they're so cynical, though. Their book on the 1988 election is about the most cynical thing I've ever read about politics. Anyway.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Wake Us When It's Over. Put it this way. The title of the book is Wake Us When It's Over.
Jules and Jack were good friends of mine. They were left wingers. I used to play poker with them all the time, but they were intractable liberals. They just couldn't look past their nose.
I've read several of Wickover's books.
They both hated Reagan. Both hated Reagan.
Their book, Wickover's book on the relationship between Nixon and Agnew, is one of my favorites. Strange Bedfellows.
Yes, that was terrific. And his book Marathon on 1976 is terrific. It's a very, very good book.
So let me ask you a question that's posited by historians. We all know that the economy was in terrible shape in 1980. We did have a little bit of patriotic adrenaline when the Americans beat the Soviets 4-3 in the Olympics on Washington's birthday in 1980.
Magnificent.
But if Jimmy Carter's rescue effort succeeds, despite everything else that's going wrong with the economy, do you believe, as a Reagan scholar, he would have won in 80 if he had figured out a way to get the hostages out of Iran?
No, it wasn't enough. We still had high inflation. We had high gasoline. We had high unemployment. We had the Soviets
high interest rates.
High interest rates. The Soviets were winning on the world stage. Everything was running against Jimmy Carter, and getting the hostages out may have given him an extra boost in the numbers, but Reagan would have still won in the final analysis. Instead of being 51-40, which is what it was, and 7 million votes, it would have been 50 to 45 and 5 million votes.
And maybe Anderson doesn't run. Who knows? I mean, that's the what ifs.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a quick question. I found this interesting. I remember reading a book on President Reagan, and in the book, quoted is James Baker, who was his chief of staff and then later Secretary of the Treasury, and then became Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush. And Baker, when asked how Reagan treated him, said he treated us all the same, like hired help. That's a direct quote.
Yeah.
I interviewed Governor and now President of Purdue, Mitch Daniels, and I'd love your thoughts on Governor Daniels when you're done with this answer. And he smiled and said, I know exactly what Jim means. So what exactly does Jim mean?
It means that with few exceptions, like Lynn Nofsinger and Ed Meese, Reagan kept the staff at arm's length. Reagan understood management, which Carter never understood. Carter was, scheduling, times on the White House tennis courts instead of being president of the United States. Reagan understood the presidency to be a magnificent bully pulpit and not a managerial concern. His job was to communicate big thoughts. That is really, you think about it, Robert, the biggest, most important responsibility of the president is to communicate good ideas, really. Yeah, you can sign legislation and stuff like that, but really, truly, is that the Constitution is pretty silent about the executive authority of the President of the United States. Don't forget, these men were terrified after King George II and King George III, and they didn't want to institute the presidency with too much power, but they left it, so they were kind of silent about it. But what was left unspoken was how much the president could affect America and the world from the bully pulpit. And so Reagan had things on his mind. You look at his letters, you look at his writings, you look at his speeches, you look at his radio broadcasts. He wasn't thinking about, Jim Baker needs a haircut today. He was thinking about, how can I expand freedom in the world? How can I expand freedom in the United States? How can I push back on big government? You look at all of his speeches. How can I increase the power of the individual? How many times in his speeches he uses the term individual in terms of more freedom and less bullying authority of the federal government. So Reagan was that way. I know, my interaction with Reagan was many times. It was always warm. It was always cordial. But I wasn't on his. I was on the campaign staff, but I was never on the White House staff, not really, except for the White House Conference on Small Business. But I never interacted with Reagan on that. But I understand what Jim means. I understand what Mitch says about it, is that he viewed them as they were part of the executive support group, and they had certain jobs to fulfill. And we're supposed to do these things. We're not supposed to sit around and talk about our golf game. So I understand completely what Jim says. But there were certain people that Reagan was really warm and friendly with. One was Frank. One was Len Nofsinger. Another was Ed Meese. A couple of
California folks.
Yes, California folks. That's right. Yeah.
We have some connections here to the Reagan administration here in Indiana. Lou Gehrig, who's a public relations guru here in Indianapolis. Peter Rustoven, who I think was a lawyer in the...
and he was a terrific writer, too.
Yes, he is a very good writer.
Yes, and he worked on the 80 convention newsletter.
And then Mitch Daniels, who's president of Purdue and governor of Indiana for 2 terms. One of the things that happens when presidents, governors, mayors, in my case, because I worked for the mayor of Indianapolis, it's really a springboard to the rest of your life in ways that you're not really sure when you take the gigs. But in the case of Ronald Reagan, when you look at who came out of his administration and what their accomplishments were afterwards, that's really one of his biggest legacies. Yes.
It was like a farm team for a Major League Baseball team. The farm team came out of the Reagan administration. Even today, it's just that Adam Laxalt's running in Nevada, and he's the grandson of Paul Laxalt, who was Ronald Reagan's best friend. I knew Paul Laxalt very well. And you've got a lot of former Reaganites running for office all around the country. Is that you've got sheepers? What is the Reagan Alumni Directory? Is a living document. It's a list of Reagan, and living because it keeps growing. And this is how many years after he left? He left in 1989. So it's what, 30 some odd years he left office, and probably 30 years since he passed. 25 years since he passed away, and everybody wants to be associated with Reagan. The Carter Alumni Directory, if it exists, is a very tiny little document, and the Bush Quayle Alumni Directory is a very tiny little document. But the Reagan Alumni Directory is quite extensive.
I'm not the most conservative Republican in this world. I'm kind of what you would call perhaps an urban Republican, which is reflective of my upbringing. And military service before and after being born and raised here in Indianapolis. But I will say that when I'm asked that, why are you a Republican? I usually just kind of chuckle, shrug my shoulders and say, Ronald Reagan.
That's as good of an answer as any, Robert. That's good as, if you wanted to answer it at another level, you would say, I think I'm logical.
Whether it's Kennedy or whether it's Reagan, or, let's give credit where credit's due. Clinton or Barack Obama, right? You create these situations where successful presidencies, because you're so prominent, you can put your stamp, your intellectual stamp and personality on a generation of would-be voters and future voters. That's
right. That's why they call them Reagan Democrats, or why Kennedy is so revered, why the new frontier is so revered. Why
obviously Franklin Roosevelt.
Huh?
Obviously Franklin Roosevelt.
Absolutely. Well, that brings up a good point. John Patrick Diggins, who was an old friend of mine, he was in many ways the historian of the American left in the 1960s. He wrote books on the environmental movement and the women's movement and civil rights. But his last book, and he was at Berkeley doing data with Reagan in the 60s over the free speech movement, the whole thing. His last book was called Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. And in this book, this college professor says that Reagan is one of our four greatest presidents. Because like Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, he also freed or saved many, many people. And he thought that was the most important criteria for an American president. Does it, at the end of the day, does he, in our modern interpretation of the presidency, did Herbert Hoover save a lot of people? Maybe not.
So let's do a counterfactual real quick, because I want to stick on that point. And we're talking with Craig Shirley here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Mr. Shirley is an author and historian, particularly of the Reagan years. But he's also written a couple books on World War II, and we have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure I get to those for sure. Yeah. But let's say Jimmy Carter wins re-election in 80, is succeeded at least for one term by Walter Mondale, his vice president. Are we still fighting the Cold War in 2022, or what year does it end?
Yeah, no, they were still prop up. Carter did view Soviets as his kissing cousins, as he is a Democrat. He viewed the Soviets as his kissing cousin. Yeah. Maybe they shouldn't have psychological hospitals, or they shouldn't beat so many people, stuff like that. But we can overlook that for the bigger goal of world collectivism. We can overlook that. We'll reform them later. So yes, the Cold War would have continued, and as a matter of fact, there would not have been a Cold War because Carter would have acquiesced to the Soviets.
So
he did. We know the history is proven. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan and he did nothing. The Soviets put nuclear tipped submarines with nuclear tipped missiles. He put them into Cuba, and Carter did nothing. Time after time after time, Carter was challenged by the left of the Soviet Union and did nothing to resist.
Is it fair to give President Carter credit, however, because I remember he got booed for saying all these things in the 1980 Democratic Convention, to give President Carter some credit for initiating the arms buildup, reinvesting in the military towards the end of his term, restarting the registration for the draft, that sort of thing. So is that judicious, or is that just me trying to be fair?
Don't forget, this was a man who went to Notre Dame University and gave the commencement speech in 1977. And he said, quote, "We have to get over our inordinate fear of communism," close quote. Now, what kind of president talks like that? Except for one who is sympathetic to collectivism, to the Soviets, and wants to slobber over the Soviets and get down and be the useful idiot that Lenin spoke of.
Let's pivot a little bit in the few minutes we have remaining. I've had several World War II authors on the podcast. I'm a big fan of the time period. Most everyone is. One of the absolute best books I have ever read on any subject is Victor Davis Hanson's book, The Second World Wars. Just completely opened my mind to so many things. I'm like, how the hell do I not know this? I've read so much about this time period.
Marvelous.
It's terrific. Anyway,
Yes.
Craig Shirley has written 2 books on World War II, December 1941, 31 Days That Changed America and Saved the World. In your book that came out this year in 2022, April 1945, The Hinge of History. I love the Churchillian title, Churchillian-esque title. Is that the hell you'd say it?
Sure.
Of your April 45 book.
Thank you.
Why did you decide to get into this period of history, and why write these bookend, from the American point of view, almost bookend titles?
Well, if you go back, is that my interest in World War II is acute because of my family. Every Sunday after church, we would gather at my grandmother's house or my mother's house and have a roast or a turkey or a chicken or something, Sunday dinner. And around the table were grandmothers and grandfathers and aunts and uncles and my parents and things like that. And invariably, the conversation always turned to the war. As in, my grandfather might say, well, I bought that LaSalle before the war, but it didn't sell until after the war, which of course made sense because Detroit wasn't producing new cars anyway during World War II. Or somebody would talk about mixing the Oleo butter with the dye, which was, something that was the kids had to do was to stir up Oleo butter with dye, yellow dye, to make it look more palatable, even though it tasted like crap. And they talk about rationing, and they talk about this, and everybody made some sort of sacrifice. My grandfather tried 3 times to enlist, and 3 times he was turned away because he was blind as a bat, like Reagan. They would say to him, Ellsworth, you're blind as a bat. You got 4 dependents. You're 42 years old. We're not that desperate. So he became a civil defense block captain. Both my grandmothers were Rosie the Riveters. One was a bomb inspector, and she didn't live long enough for me to ask her what a bomb inspector did. And I feel bad about that. The other one was a machine gun tester. There was a factory in Syracuse. They make lights for traffic lights. I can't think of the name of it. But for World War II, they made machine guns. And she would stand there on an assembly line. A machine would come down the line. She'd pick it up and she'd test fire it, put it down, and the next one would come down the conveyor belt. She'd pick it up, fire it, set it down. And so she was a Rosie the Riveter. My father was a Boy Scout, was a 12, 13-year-old Boy Scout, and the government used the Boy Scouts to distribute promotional posters to churches and bars and grocery stores and restaurants. So he pinned up these posters, loose lip sync ships and cautionary tales about medicine and about dangerous women and with VD and things like that. And he put those up around stores and restaurants and churches and stuff in Syracuse, New York. My mother was then, she was born 32, so she was 8 or 9 years old at the beginning of the war. And she's with us still with us, thank God. And I once queried her about this because I thought victory guards were somewhat of a PR stunt, but the Roosevelt administration, she got indignant. She said, I had a victory garden. It wasn't a fraud. Everybody I knew had a victory garden. There was victory gardens in backyards, small farms, on top of tenements. Is there victory gardens? And as a matter of fact, in 1944, victory gardens produced 1/4 of all the vegetables consumed in America, which is astonishing. But we need to feed the Russian soldier, the British soldier, the American soldier. And so that's where we were sending all of our vegetables. It was overseas to feed the boys. And so we had to grow it at home. So, and of course, there was also rubber drives and scrap drives and paper drives and things like that. So my family was not unique. You know why? Because every family did this. But everybody, and of course, my uncle made the ultimate sacrifice. He was shot down and killed in the Pacific on his 20th birthday in 1945. Shot down in his TBF-1 Avenger.
Moment of silence there for him. That's
for
you just feel so
Barney Ellsworth Shirley. And it was on his 20th birthday.
You titled your latest book, April 1945, The Hinge of History. Why did you choose April as opposed to, say, August, which is when the atomic bombs were dropped, or another month? I mean, you have some consequential deaths. Obviously, in April, you have Roosevelt, who dies on April 12th. Hitler kills himself on April 30th. But why April and not another month?
Because every day is a red letter day in the news. There is something monumental happening every day in April 1945. It's a much overlooked month. You know, August would have been the obvious month, but so many people have written about August. So I looked at the calendar, and I saw all these things happening in April of 1945. Big things and little things, fun things like the fact that Lou Gehrig's baseball trophies sold at auction for $1 a piece. Can you imagine that?
You're kidding.
Millions they'd be worth today? With the millions? His MVP trophy, the American League, fetched $1, and his trophy he got for the day he said, "I'm the greatest." I
consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm. I'm the luckiest man alive. And LaGuardia is there, and Babe Ruth is there, and all these old and current Yankees are there. And Yankee Stadium is jam-packed. And he gives this tear-jerker of a speech, and he's given a plaque. And that plaque went for $1 at auction. He had passed away, about a year earlier in 1940. But there's stuff in there, not only about baseball, but about the American home front, about rationing, everything, gasoline rationing, meat rationing, vegetable rationing, fruit rationing, everything you can imagine. There's a lot of lively stories about actors and actresses and how Frank Sinatra pierced his own eardrum with a sewing needle to avoid military service. Just scads of stuff like that, big and little. And of course, FDR dies, and FDR dying, Bob. Do you go by Bob?
You're Craig Shirley. You can call me what you like. Okay. Even though I guess we should make some sort of airplane reference since your last name is Shirley.
Yeah, don't call me Shirley. Yeah, never heard that before. Robert. I lost my train of thought now. What was I talking about?
You're talking about Roosevelt's death in Warm Springs.
It was monumental. It was huge. It's one of those things everybody can say. My mother remembers where she was when she was told FDR died. It was the same thing with John Kennedy. It was the same thing with September 11th. Everybody who was alive knew where they were and knew what was going on when they were told Franklin Roosevelt had died. His funeral was the pomp and circumstance was astonishing, and also, of course, like flags around the world, like in Moscow, were lowered to half staff. Flags in Moscow were lowered to half staff. FDR was not just part of the big three with Churchill and Stalin. He was, in many ways, the president of the world, not just the president of the United States. He had to clothe and feed and house and supply the British soldier, the Soviet soldier, the American soldier. He had to fight a two-front war in Europe and in Japan. He had allies of Hitler German troops were all around him, and in South America and in Italy and North Africa. So he had all these things going on. And of course, he had all of his children and his tense relationship with his wife. So you had these enormous things going on in his life and in his personal life and his professional life. And so when he died, it was as if not just the president of the United States died, but it was the president of the world died. Everybody. Bob Dole writes in his book about soldiers in dugouts in Italy, weeping in their trenches when they heard that FDR died.
We are talking with historian and author Craig Shirley. We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Shirley, are you ready? They're easy, I promise.
Yeah. Okay. They're like a game show, right?
A little bit, a little bit. One or
Okay.
two may cause you to pause for a second and give it some thought. But question number 1, what was your first job?
My first job was working at a campground on Cape Cod in North Truro, the Horton's campground. And I used to bike every morning 10 miles to the campground, and then at 5 o'clock, bike 10 miles back on Route 6, which cuts right through the Cape. And I had the time of my life. I was cleaning out toilets. I was picking up trash. I was working in a garden. I was painting a barn. I did all these things in the summer of 1973. And it was my first real job. I had jobs before that, raking leaves and shoveling walks and stuff like that. But that was my first real job. And I had the time of my life.
Question number 2, what was your first concert?
Three Dog Night. I think it may have been my last concert, as a matter of fact. So, no, I went to the Rolling Stones No Security tour.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Catherine Drinker Bowden wrote Miracle at Philadelphia.
Yeah, I have that book. It's terrific.
It is wonderful. It is the best single book on the Constitution and what happened there in Philadelphia, and it's just terrific.
It is terrific. Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Philadelphia and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Those are very popular. I can just say those are popular answers.
I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. But I could be cute and say, well, I'd like to be there at Ford's Theater, but I don't think I'd want to be there at Ford's Theater because I couldn't stop Booth from pulling the trigger. If I could go there and stop Booth from pulling the trigger, then I'd choose April 15th, 1865.
All you had to do was convince Lincoln's bodyguard not to go have a drink or two downstairs. You wouldn't have to stop Booth. Just stop the drunk.
Yeah.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to discuss anything you want, whom would you choose?
Johnny Carson.
Living today.
Oh, living today. Let me think. So many of my mentors and friends have passed away, Bill Buckley and others. Somebody who I like very, very much and I admire very, very much and has been very good to me is George Will. I'd pick George Will.
He was on our podcast, and I promised him when he came on the podcast, when he agreed, that I would talk about 3 things. I'd ask him questions about history, baseball, and Mitch Daniels.
How about that? 3 things he admires.
Absolutely. You said nice things about Governor Daniels before the podcast. You've known him for a long time?
I've known Mitch since 1982, when he was with the Republican Senatorial Committee and I was with the Republican National Committee.
So his success and everything he's achieved is no surprise to you, I'm sure?
Oh, no. He was always a very talented individual, very likable individual, very can-do type of individual.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been author and historian Craig Shirley. Craig, thank you so much for your time. It was a terrific discussion. I really, really enjoy your books. Keep writing them.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. And thank you, Chris. This was enjoyable. I hope I get the chance to come back on.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, fellas.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.